Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming to this outbrief of the Unethical Wargaming Working Group. Especially my thanks go to my two Japanese colleagues, if they're watching, because it's about 3 o'clock in the morning for them, and to my colleagues in Hungary and Lithuania, because it's about 10 o'clock at night for them. I will excuse them if instead of watching me, they're having a drink or fast asleep. So this working group had a focus. It looked at how to use unethical practices to make a war game say what you want it to say. It was inspired by a museum I came across many years ago. It was a museum of bad art. That didn't mean you just took incompetent art and put it in a museum. This art was very carefully selected to show how things could go wrong with art. So I asked myself when I was looking at deceptive practices, and then up came the theme for this conference of ethics and wargaming. I turned it on its head and asked, okay, what can we learn with the thought experiment of deliberately assuming malign intent by any of the game's stakeholders? They wish to manipulate the game to wrongfully inform a decision that would follow the game. Okay, how can the hypothesis is that by doing that we identify additional unethical practices that would not surface if we simply looked at best practices from benignly produced games. What we should be looking at, in my view, is what goes right when you design a game wrongfully. And that tells us some more things that we can use to avoid, getting into trouble. We used a three-phase normative approach, starting in October 2020. Okay, we started work. Invitation was widely disseminated. There's an additional requirement to the two mentioned there, and that is that either the invitee or I have to be able to make an argument that says their experience somehow relates to what we're doing here. There was no requirement to be an expert in wargamers. We ended up with 28 contributors, about 2/3 to 3/4 of the people who signed up. In the discussion, 42 topics surfaced, spread over 243 discussion posts. And 7 of my colleagues, myself included, wrote some hardcore research papers on the topic. So there will, of course, be emergent concepts and topics that surface as we go ahead and analyze those discussion posts and look across the papers, topics that cut across all of the currently discussed topics. And yesterday, we ran a workshop, and the goal of that workshop was design an ethics game. It's a game between the sponsor, stakeholder, and wargame designer of the game. And we assume that, in this case, for the simplicity, the sponsor approves and likes the concept being gamed and wants the game to enhance that concept's reputation. There's an influential stakeholder who wants the game to denigrate the reputation of that concept amongst senior leadership, and a wargame designer caught in the middle who just wants the game to be unbiased. So how would you design a game between those three players to explore move and counter move in an unethical competition? We use an infinite whiteboard, conceptboard.com, and Zoom. And we discussed using the game to bring the sponsor, stakeholder, and designer into alignment. And that's a product, along with the working group products of the discussion and the papers. Those two products. Then we have a third product, reflection. What are post-conference ideas and papers from any of the workshop participants? So by the 12th of July, the timetable here, I'll have analyzed the discussions, working papers and materials, etc., and produce an executive summary, draft report 2nd of August. The working group members get a copy of the draft report to review, edit, make changes, and I'll post the final report to PACSIMS on 30th of August and make it available to Commander General Staff College Foundation. So those are some of the perspectives brought to the table by this group, quite wide-ranging, probably not all of them in there. Not all of them wargame related, but all of them impacting wargaming and wargaming design. Okay, cheering, no, that should have been cheating. We did not do cheering during the working group. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to run your eyeball over that. So some caveats. We were looking, mostly because of our structure, at professional war games run for DoD at the operational and higher level, done for analytic purposes. Everything we talked about in the working group can also be applied to education games, training games, socialization games, and so on. But we were looking at analytic games. And because we're dealing with senior officers or senior civilian personnel, you rarely have a predominance of them who are gamers. Mostly they're not gamers. The patience or appetite a general officer has for sitting down and learning a bunch of game rules is limited. Even when you do manage to persuade them, well, it's just like operational maps are. Here's the map. Instead of icons on a screen, you've got these little chips. They represent your units. Even when you do get that, something is quite clear. The activity is discussion-based. Bottom right is a typical scene in a war game. The cell is discussing the intel they've just received as an update from a previous move and discussing what their next move should be. Top left, they're discussing what their next move should be. Historically, bottom left, they're discussing. Top right, education game, they're discussing. So what we end up looking at in a lot of cases is the pathologies of small group discussions and how these may influence game design, game execution, game outcome, game interpretation, and game reporting. Okay, so some time back, 2004, the Naval War College Wargaming Department started discussing the inner and the outer game, top left. What we often talk about as a war game is in fact the inner game of a much larger game that's being played. That game is played between the sponsor, the war game designer, and by the way, their organizations and their bosses too. These are basically the three witches of wargaming, and other stakeholders, influential stakeholders. War game players who pulled into the inner game may very well be playing in the outer game as well. And at each one of those stages in that outer game, running around the loop, analysis, game report, decision, etc., discussions are held. It's not like doing math and there's a right answer. There's discussion and interpretation. Inside the war game itself, the inner game, you have observation going on and you have points of discussion. The final planning meeting to discuss how to put the meeting, final plenary together, the actual final plenary, the after action review. Okay, you observe that in order to manipulate and wrongfully corrupt the outbrief to the sponsor. If you successfully do that, then the report to the sponsor will not matter. We all understand the issue of the sponsor wanting the outbrief on the last day of the game, before anyone's had a chance to actually do analysis, and then not reading the report, an analytic report that comes out several weeks later. I've sat in a very senior war game and watched the sponsor demand the outbrief halfway through the game. I'll leave it to you to imagine how motivated the players were for the second half of the game. So we looked at a group, a bunch of group dynamics effects that could be used to exploit both the inner and the outer game. Over on the left, there's a group of them, rule of 8, brainstorming and bogstat, etc. Every one of these has best practices attached to them, which can be broken unobtrusively and in a way that manipulates people. And our working group looked at techniques for doing that and at techniques then for countering it, as in the game I've just mentioned. The threat, why should you actually, it's not just a thought experiment, there is a threat there. Intellectual fraud driven by those three bullets there: career risk, unrepeatability, and overconfidence of senior people. The vice provost of Caltech, while he was there, and he wrote a book about this, looked at intellectual fraud in the science world, and he discovered that those three items there were always present in when intellectual fraud occurs. And we now ask ourselves, why is this related to wargaming? Well, career risk in senior and important games, senior officers are actually at career risk. Not talking about their performance in the game, but if you have a game, serious game about aircraft carriers, and in the game your aircraft carrier sinks or you get it sunk, and then the Air Force uses that game result to push for extra funding for them and cutting off funding for the Navy because, gosh, look what the game said. However wrong that conclusion might be, there's career risks there. It's hard to repeat. War games have a reputation for being unrepeatable. And let's face it, most senior officers are not promoted due to their lack of confidence. They believe, most people believe, they already know the answer to most problems before they actually have to bother to do the work. That's an extraordinary claim for me to make. If you ask anybody, they will all admit, myself included, no, I don't always know the right answer. I need to do the research. But then if you ask me, what about this decision here and now? That's a different matter. I'm much more confident, in my opinion, this time. It's those other times where I will admit to maybe not being right. So what is to be done? Well, deep and wide knowledge and expertise, not just in wargaming. It's not good enough to play hobby games and read hobby game manuals. You need to have a wide range of social science knowledge, and we'll have a look at some of this here. So initial insights. Wait for the final report before you take any of this away. Unethical or incompetent behavior in the outer game will dominate the inner game. So what goes wrong in the outer game dominates. No amount of brilliant design, execution, or analysis of the inner game will save you from that. It's a bit like a saying we have in the analytic world: you cannot solve poor game design by brilliant analysis. Well, you cannot solve manipulated outer game play by brilliant and unbiased inner game play, because the output of your inner game goes for interpretation, report writing, and briefing, all moves in that outer game with stakeholders busy moving around trying to get the game to say what they want it to say. However, if you can manipulate the inner game, that will derail an ethical outer game. All those best practices which you're familiar with can be used unethically to deceive the sponsor, and we have methods for identified methods for doing that, in order to identify when you're doing it inadvertently and to come up with best practices for avoiding it. Okay, the unethical methods can all be used in a way that not only are effective, but you're praised. You're actually praised for being open, inclusive, creative, etc. And I have personally seen most of those behaviors by senior military and civilians. And when you read the final report and start looking around, you'll start recognizing it too. It's called the Bieder-Meinhof phenomenon, or the frequency illusion. So the actual conclusion here is, as an expert wargamer, you must be familiar with a range of social science disciplines: psychology, including psychology of individual and small group behaviors, decision analysis, reversal effects, social choice, game theory, cognitive biases, and so on. You never stop learning here, okay? If you're not familiar with those topics, You prepare to be deceived while thanking your deceiver. Okay. So, third phase of the three-phase normative process I mentioned. In the week following this conference, if you have any insights or ideas about unethical wargaming, send them to me at that email address. Depending on what you send me, I shall roll it into the final report and stick your name on the front of the report, unless you ask me not to put your name on the front. So I shall now address any questions that you might have. That's assuming that there are people actually out there. Is education the best way to identify where? Education is certainly, I believe, a necessary precondition, but practice and training sort of top that off and make it stick. People learn through two fundamental methods, trauma and repetition. So you decide, you know, the educate once and then give them the trauma via repetition through exercises and training and so on. I'm just going to move my, there we go. So what else? If not familiar with the game, if not familiar with the game, what indicators to look for as an outsider to screen out these unethical results? I would look for how, okay, so you're saying you weren't there at the game. You've just got the sort of game report or the game briefing. I would start looking for conflict of interest. Who are the designers? Who are the stakeholders? Who was the sponsor? And by stakeholder, I mean influential stakeholders, and what influence did they have on each other? Is the game being produced by an organization that it has financial interests, say, in the concept being gamed, and so on? So the first indicator is conflict of interest. The second is, can you get any information from the game report about the process used for doing the design or the process used for the game? A big indicator here is, and you often see it written up in the report, there'll be a report about the post-game discussion that was part of the interpretation with alternatives and people voting on the alternatives. That's a big no-no. Voting schemes are great for violence-free transitions of political power. They're useless as an analytic method, and they're widely open to abuse. But thank you for that question. I'm going to add it to the working group report as something we need to write about and identify. What are the indicators if you weren't deeply embedded in the outer game or the inner game? Right, depends on who you are, doesn't it? If you are the game designer, the inner game designer, you call it out up your chain of command. If your boss does not support you, we're back to the three witches of wargaming. If your boss does not support you, you document what is going on and the likely effects on the game, okay? The game output, the game execution, and what that effect would have on any game interpretation. And you pass that up your chain of command. If you're if you're a game player, okay, play the game, okay, all sorts of stuff goes on in games. Good game organizations can tease apart and remove distortions later. You know, you don't see, if you're a player, you're only seeing a very small part of the game. Play the game as honestly and as enthusiastically as you can, and after the game, write up your concerns and put it up your chain of command and also across to the war game organization, the organization that ran the war game. If paid, would you design a game for me showing all games are ethical? How much are you paying? Seriously though, no, because it's not possible to do that. And I want to get the second contract, not just do a completely unethical one. Keep my eye on the time. When I was doing my PhD, my research professor was approached by a group of industrialists. They wanted him to endorse an anti-gravity machine that they were building. And they had been offered unbelievable amounts of money to bring this anti-gravity machine to fruition, and you can imagine why. And he asked them, well, how far have you got? And they offered him, we'll give you a percentage of the cash if you just endorse the design. You are a gravitational researcher, you know, an expert. So he said, well, how far have you got? And he said, well, it stands on 3 legs and we've got 2 of the legs off the ground and we just got 1/3 more to go. Some things just aren't possible. And we asked him, why didn't you take the money? You know, I could have done with my rent being paid as a poor student. And he pointed out, you never get a second contract. Next question. Unethical practices best used by certain groups, students, military analysts, etc. The military love to use bogsats and brainstorming. Now, whether they are, those are the easiest ones to manipulate. And I've seen it done. I don't know, I don't think, very few people sit down and say, I'm going to use an unethical practice. What they sit down and say is, we've got this problem, clearly X is the right answer. Let's get everyone together and organize the conversation so that, you know, goes in a right way. Town hall meetings where the order of the agenda items changes people's opinion. You know, which order you're asked a question can be used to reverse the answer you give. They're called reversal techniques. So bureaucrats, civil servants, people very senior in the military, they understand all of that and they use them. Students I think are probably clueless, but they'll learn. Analysts, I'd love to believe analysts were deeply honest. I would guess for analysts, it's cherry picking, asserting the consequence. There's a whole range of techniques they use inadvertently often, but I couldn't say anything more than that about whether some groups prefer others. Got to be aware of all of them. Someone in an organization will be trying one of them. Next. That's the last question. Well, I'm going to give you back 6 minutes if anyone is still here. Let's just make sure. I want to share my. I've lost it. Anyway, send me an email with any ideas you have that's been triggered in the next week. It's called reflection. You go away from the conference, you have a drink, you relax over the weekend, and then during the week you suddenly think to yourself, aha, I forgot to ask that question, or here's a good idea, or Stephen's wrong here and here's why. Send those to me, stephen.downsmartin@gmail.com, and I will take them seriously and accredit you with the idea if it gets into the report. So thank you very much. I suggest we call it a day, at least for this presentation. I'm going to leave the studio.